Welcome to the channel.
And welcome to the Bicentennial Mall State Park.
Hello vlog.
I was actually
About to plug the YouTube on my Snapchat.
I took back my vlog. Hey brothers.
Ciao. You should like and subscribe. Hit that little bell.
Bing. And share with your friends.
Tell your grandma's hamsters.
Can I dab? Little history lesson for you all. Yippee!
That's why I'm just keeping it rolling, because I know you can edit it out.
My leg hurts.
So now my socks are wet.
I'm tired.
Anybody want a Gatorade? Non-sponsored.
Are these cicadas?
Now we're only standing on Murfreesboro, and I just scorched our house with our toes, and so now it's gonna be a flat pancake.
Never been there.
So, my first question to you guys is, why do you think we're called the Bicentennial Capitol Mall State Park? Any guesses?
Built in the Bicentennial?
200 years. That is the first part. We are a representation of 200 years of Tennessee state history. And then, of course, if y'all turn around, we've got our state capitol there. So in 1950s and 60s, we had the south, east, and west side of Nashville starting to rise. And we were no longer to be able to see the Capitol building from those views. But in this area, on the northern end of the state capitol, was a marshier wetland. So it wasn't really conducive for building big buildings like you see here in Tennessee. So what we did is we preserved this land to always have somewhere to see the state capitol. Now, of course, Bicentennial Mall has a wide variety of memorials and nature side as well, and just a lot of cool things to see. Even where we're standing right now, there's a lot of cool things to see from where we're at. First two things I like to point out is we have two very large flagpoles. Does anybody have a guess why we have two large ones? I'll give you a hint. It's similar to the first answer. They represent 100 years each, so 200 years of Tennessee state history, and there's 8 smaller poles that are surrounding it. And that counts up to 16 because we were the 16th state to join the United States. Another cool feature you see here at the first location is we have what used to be a water fountain location. It is not working currently and is in the process of getting fixed, but it is 31 water fountains. And that represents 31 river systems in the state of Tennessee. One of the more unique ones being the Duck River. That is the most biodiverse river in Tennessee. It actually has more fish in the Duck River than all the rivers combined in Europe. It's a very cool river. Another one that I like pointing out is the Watauga River. And that has a state park that's on that river. We like to plug state parks when we can. And that is the Sycamore Shoal State Park. It's an absolutely beautiful location. Now, a cool thing to see on the wall here is y'all see that line right there on the wall? That is actually an indicator of where the floods were in 2010. Horrible floods. And that is a representation of how high it got here. I got a cool little map to show y'all over here on this side of the wall. So this is a very cool map to see. Yeah. This represents all 31 water fountains. And while I'm standing here, there is a trail right behind me that represents one river that actually all these rivers lead to. Does anybody have a guess what river that is?
Mississippi River.
Mississippi. It's like my friend Dory. All the drains lead to the Mississippi. So
So as Christian mentioned, this is the history side of the park. It started 1 billion years ago, and we go all the way up to 1996 when the park was created. Because geology takes a really long time, at about 100 feet, we're going to jump to 10,000 BC. About 240 million years ago is when we would have started having the major features of Tennessee cropping up. So Cumberland Plateau, Appalachian Mountains, things like that. Tennessee would have spent most of its history as a shallow ocean, which is why we have so much rock in Tennessee, because of all that plant life and microbial life that's settled over time and formed all of that limestone shell, coal deposits throughout the state. So, 100 feet, 10,000 BC, so we've already jumped 1 billion years. The first humans that would have come into this area would have come here about 12,000 BC. They would have crossed that land bridge from Asia, gotten into the North America continent, and then eventually made their way down to the southeast. We know that Native Americans were here, they had distinct cultures, they had extensive trade routes, they interacted with each other a lot, but we don't know what they called themselves, how they differentiated themselves from one another, so rather than labeling all of them and calling them things that we don't know what they would have been called, instead we call the entire southeastern region and that entire time period the woodland period. This is also when you would have had a lot of your mound building cropping up in Tennessee, so places like Middle Fork Bottoms, Old Stone Fort, Pinson Mounds would have started in the woodland period and gone through the Mississippian period. The first European to come through this area is Hernando de Soto. He would have started in Florida in 1540, 1541. They would have started an expedition looking for gold. They would have gone north, gotten to about where Knoxville would eventually end up, and then started going southwest and then eventually west. He and his men end up finding nothing, and he actually ends up passing away during the expedition. He ends up being buried in the Mississippi River, and his men go back to Florida. Hernando de Soto and his contemporaries are a great example as to why it's difficult for us to know about Native Americans prior to European contact. Once European contact occurs, everybody starts moving around, whether it's because of disease, famine, warfare, what have you. On top of that, Europeans, not always the best at recording things. The example we always give is the Appalachian Mountains get their name from the Appalachian tribe in the panhandle of Florida because someone applied their name to a mountain range hundreds of miles away from them. If I were to ask y'all what tribe was in Tennessee, what would y'all say? Most often we get Cherokee. And that's not wrong. The Cherokee would have been in the Carolinas and East Tennessee. We also have Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and other tribes. One of the reasons Cherokee is most often mentioned is because they're really synonymous with the state. One, because we end up being the final council grounds for the Cherokee prior to the Indian Removal Act. We'll talk about that here in a couple of decades. But also because they're one of the 5 civilized tribes. And they got that moniker during that time period because they were more willing to take on European culture. Because they were more willing to take on European culture, they interacted with Europeans more, they got written down more, and had a better understanding from Europeans. Here in 1772, we have the formation of the Watauga Association. This is the first contracted European settlement in this area east of the Appalachian Mountains. West of the Appalachian Mountains. One of the reasons this is the first is because the British had treaties with the Cherokee and other Native American tribes saying they wouldn't cross the Appalachian Mountains. Humans aren't great at listening to rules all the time, so people constantly did it either for hunting, exploration, what have you, but all of those would have been just temporary expeditions. They could have lasted months or years, but they would have always gone back. This is going to be the first contracted settlement and form of government for Europeans in this area. It's kind of that Tri-City, Kingsport, Elizabethton area. The reason it's significant for us is 2. 1, the individuals who start this are going to be the people who end up creating Tennessee, but 2, this is 1772. By 1796, 24 years later, 70,000 Europeans and Americans have moved into this area enough to justify Tennessee becoming a state. So it really highlights how this was that frontier at one point for those original colonies and original states. 1780, we're in the midst of the Revolutionary War. Tennessee is not a state yet, but we like to claim that we won the Revolutionary War because of the Over-Mountain-Men and the Battle of Kings Mountain. Those individuals living in the Watauga Association aren't super concerned about the British Army because, of course, they have an entire mountain range between them and Britain and everything that's going on in the colonies. But the British approach most Native American tribes, including the Cherokee, and say, hey, those treaties we haven't been enforcing, if you join our side, we promise we'll start enforcing them and we won't let people onto your territory. So most Native American tribes end up siding with the British. That brings the fight very much into the backyard of the Wataugans. On top of that, you have this individual here, Patrick Ferguson. He is a Scotsman who was tasked by the British Army to drum up colonial support. So he was recruiting soldiers directly from the colonies. He had pretty good success on the coastal portions of the Carolinas, but the further inland he moved, the less and less success he had. And by the time he had to worry about the Watauguans and having to cross a mountain range, he really didn't want to do it. So he took a bit of a gamble, and he sent them a letter that essentially said, join me or I'm going to come burn down your town. It's a gamble. Rather than convincing them, he may have upset them. And so they decide, well, now we have to get into the middle of this and we're going to go fight. So they travel over the Appalachian Mountains. Because they're constantly going over the mountains, they have the moniker the Over Mountain Men. And they engage Patrick Ferguson's men at the Battle of Kings Mountain. They have a couple of things going in their favor. One, they're frontiersmen, so they've spent most of their life hunting to survive. So they're very good marksmen. On top of that, the western portions of the Carolinas are very similar to the eastern portions of Tennessee. So they're very comfortable in that kind of environment. On top of that, Patrick Ferguson is an officer in the British Army. So he wears a big red sash and rides a big white horse. So it did not take very long for one of those skilled marksmen to shoot him off of his big white horse, and he ends up dying during the battle. And shortly afterwards, his men end up surrendering. This is significant for a couple of reasons. One, it stops the British advancement into the southern colonies, which allows the southern colonies to continue supporting the northern colonies during the war. And more importantly, the British advancement going north gets very concerned about what's going on, and they pull off into Yorktown. Yorktown will ultimately be where the British have their biggest defeat and leads to the end of the war. So even though we weren't a state, we claim we won the war. This is the park's original architect.
Oh,
So I'm
wow.
going to let y'all listen to him for this portion.
Absolutely.
Georgia ran from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi. Okay? And with slavery such an issue, having senators in Washington was very important. So what did they do? They created a state of Mississippi and then a state of Alabama. So instead of having two senators, you had the same number of representatives. Instead of two senators, you now have, right, 6 senators. That's power in the Senate of the United States. And that's why the slavery thing just kept getting more complicated, because the South had money, the South had power. We know the rest is story. Pretty much with that, that's my tour. Y'all had fun? Yeah. How many rivers in Tennessee? Oh wait, that's it. Okay, so I told you about St. Paul. This is the guy. This is Jackson. And he is the reason. And there are other ranges with him. So I mean, these people, they're the trust. And I'm always looking forward to seeing him. Usually he'll stop. Why do we have 3 stars? Nobody trusted me. Okay. See the 3 stars. Okay. If you put a star at the top, that's the top star. But if you twist it, so the top star is over, there is no top star. There is no best grand division. They're all a little twisted. That's why. And I found out very quickly, when you mess with state symbols, you get it wrong. Great question.
So that monument over there is our statehood monument. I think y'all may have heard him mention, but there's a natural spring underneath it. It's now channeled underground directly to the Cumberland River just to help with flooding. But the spring it represents is called McNary Spring, and it's named for Judge John McNary, who is the individual that owned this land in the late 1700s. He was a territorial judge appointed by George Washington, and so he's a very prominent individual. One, because of that job, but also because his land had a bunch of freshwater springs on it that people came to get their drinking water, so he's very well known. Here in 1811, with aftershocks going into 1812, we have the New Madrid Seismic Zone event. This is an earthquake that is so strong, it makes the Mississippi River run backwards and flood a cypress forest and create Reelfoot Lake. Reelfoot Lake is still there. It is about as north and west Tennessee as you can get without leaving the state. The lake now is very well known for its birding and its fishing. It's one of the first places that eagles returned to Tennessee. There are stories, anecdotal stories from the time period that this earthquake is so strong it made church bells ring in DC. So it was a massive, massive. What's Tennessee's nickname?
Volunteer.
The volunteer state. So there are 2 origin stories for the volunteer nickname. The panel that created the wall decided to settle that debate by putting both stories on the wall. So the first one is here in 1815 as part of the War of 1812 because of the amount of Tennesseans that went to fight the Battle of New Orleans with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson took just about anybody who would go with him. He had privateers, which are state-sanctioned pirates, Native Americans, Tennesseans, anybody who was willing to fight, he took with him. This is one of, if not the last battle of the War of 1812, and it's what put Jackson on that national stage and sent him towards the presidency, so it was a very big deal. 1827, David Crockett is elected to U.S. Congress. There is David Crockett and there is Davy Crockett. David Crockett is the man, Davy Crockett is the myth. Even in his own lifetime, that myth was already building, and sometimes it frustrated him, but sometimes he was happy to use it to do things like getting elected to Congress. He was actually a frontiersman, spent most of his life on the frontier, and because of that, he was a very big supporter of Native American rights, because he spent so much time interacting with them. So he ends up becoming very frustrated in Congress because of things like the Indian Removal Act and not being able to help Native Americans. He'll eventually leave Congress and leave Tennessee altogether and move out west. Again, he has that frontier bug in him. 1828 and 1832, Andrew Jackson is elected president. He's going to be the first president from Tennessee. None of those presidents were born here, but they would have all claimed Tennessee as their home. Again, that frontier mentality, they moved here at a young age. Jackson's actually born before we even stayed, so it would have been difficult for him. But 1836, David Crockett's killed at the Alamo. That'll crop up here in about a decade for that volunteer nickname. Here in 1838, we have the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is specifically applied to the Cherokee as part of the Indian Removal Act, but some people also broadly apply it to other Native American tribes. You'd have over half a dozen Native American tribes forced to Oklahoma. The Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, Choctaw. The Cherokee are one of the last tribes forced to Oklahoma. I told y'all earlier that they had that moniker, one of the 5 civilized tribes. They actually attempted to fight the Indian Removal Act in the court systems, but ultimately lost that fight. So they're one of the last ones to be forced to Oklahoma. They also have one of the deadlier trails. Unfortunately, because of that map we looked at earlier with all those riverways, as well as all of the roadways we have, every trail of the Trail of Tears would have passed through Tennessee at one point or another. Red Clay State Historic Park that I mentioned earlier does a very good job of talking about them. It's outside of Chattanooga. And then also Port Royal State Park, which is in Clarksville, does a very good job of talking about. They were one of the stops on the Trail of Tears. So they do a good job talking about them. In 1844, James K. Polk is the second man elected president from Tennessee. James K. Polk is also, quote unquote, the only president to keep all of his campaign promises, including only running for one term. He, during his campaign, said he would only be president for one term. That is not a very hard commitment for him, considering he didn't want to be president to begin with. Prior to our modern primary and caucus systems, the individual parties just chose their nominee. And he was actually going for the vice presidential nomination. And his party was debating 2 other individuals for the presidential nomination. They couldn't settle on either one of them, and so they picked him as a compromise. Polk ends up being a massive workaholic. He has more land in the United States than any other president. He was known for taking most of his meals in his office. If you've ever seen photos of presidents before and after 8 years, how it really ages them, portraits of him before and afterwards, after just 4 years, it's very much the same thing. And he ends up passing away a few months after leaving office, either from pneumonia or cholera, but some people think he essentially worked himself to death. He was a huge, huge workaholic. Because of that, his wife, Sarah Polk, really helped him out with everything. She read all of his campaign speeches, helped during his presidency and his campaign. She was the person who would host people at their house. She was known for inviting congressmen and senators to the house, especially ones that didn't get along, because it would force them to have a civilized conversation because they couldn't be rude in front of her. And she also would participate during that discourse at the dinner table. She will go on to be the longest First Lady widow in U.S. history. She survives James by 40 years. And very much in that Victorian era, wore black for the rest of her life, was in mourning for the rest of her life, and she was very worried that because James fell between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, that he would be forgotten in history. So it is said that she would invite people into their house, which is a couple of blocks away from the Capitol building, and give them tours. She would talk about his legacy because she'd want people to remember him. It's very interesting that she did that because she also played a pivotal role in the formation of the State Museum. During the Civil War, the Tennessee Historical Society kept all of their items in the Capitol building. And they became very worried as the Union Army was approaching Nashville about what would happen to those items. Sarah Polk was a very loved First Lady, partly because the First Lady before her was a bit known for throwing big raucous parties. She wasn't a teetotaler, but Sarah only allowed wine in the house. She was very budget conscious, and so people thought that she was very reasonable and very much liked her. And so as the Union Army is advancing on the Capitol, the Tennessee Historical Society actually approaches Sarah and says, will you take all of these items into your house? And so she does do that. She holds them for the duration of the war, and she's actually so respected by both sides that both the Confederacy and the Union stationed guards outside of her house so that no one would bother her during the war. She holds those items for the entire war, and at the end of it, gives those items back along with some of her own personal possessions, and those items are the foundation of what the State Museum will eventually become. So she played a very important role in helping create that. Here in 1848, the volunteer nickname is solidified for Tennessee. The story goes that Tennesseans were so outraged at the death of David Crockett at the Alamo that when the federal government asked for 3,000 troops, we said 30,000 instead. Here in front of us, the wall breaks apart. Any guesses why as we go into the 1860s?
Civil War.
Civil War, yes ma'am. So the wall breaks apart here in 1850 on the word secession. The Civil War has not started yet, but this is when the first discussions of seceding begin. So, the wall itself breaks apart just to help show that fractious period for both the state and the nation. Tennessee heavily debates leaving the Union. It actually ends up taking 2 rounds of voting for us to leave. And we are the last state to leave and the first state to rejoin. We only spent about a year outside of the Union. Tennessee will go on to have the second most battles of the war. That sounds like a lot until you realize that Virginia has about 3 or 4 times as many. But we do have the 2 bloodiest battles of the war. Shiloh is the bloodiest battle by overall casualties, over 25,000 casualties during that battle. And the Battle of Stones River is the bloodiest by percentages. So more men involved in that battle were injured or killed than in any other battle. The Battle of Stones River is very important for the war because it ends in a draw, but the Confederacy withdrew from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Because they withdrew, the Union had control of Nashville and Murfreesboro, and having control of those 2 cities allowed them to have control of the rail lines throughout Tennessee. And having those rail lines really helped them in moving troops and resupplying troops especially. During the Civil War, we have the 3rd president from Tennessee. This is going to be Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson assumes the presidency after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Johnson is picked to be Lincoln's running mate because the idea that he would potentially be a unifying candidate. Being a Southerner, he may help Lincoln get some Southern votes. What it really did is make everyone not like Johnson. If you're from the North, you didn't like him because he was Southerner. If you're from the South, you didn't like him because he ran with Lincoln. He was also not liked here in the South because he was a staunch Unionist. He was not anti-slavery, but he firmly believed that the Confederacy did not have the right to secede from the United States. He didn't get a bad deal, though. He made people not like him in his own right. He is the first president to ever be impeached. After assuming office, he does not get along with his Secretary of War, so much so that he wants to remove him from his cabinet. The legislature does not agree with that, and ultimately passes legislation saying that that Johnson has to get their approval in order to do that. His solution for that problem is to wait till they went on recess and do it anyways. So they come back from recess and impeach him, and he survives that impeachment by 1 vote in the Senate. So he is not only the first president to be impeached, but also the closest thing he has come to being removed. Just like the wall broke apart on that side on secession, it reforms on this side of the word Constitution. All Confederate states, in order to be readmitted to the Union, had to ratify a new Constitution acknowledging the abolition of slavery. This is going to be Tennessee's 3rd Constitution. It's the one we're under today. Here in 1873, you have a yellow fever outbreak in Memphis that kills 2,000 people. During this time period, Memphis has a lot of disease outbreaks, cholera, yellow fever, and other things, for 2 main reasons. One, about a decade prior to this, it is the fastest growing nation in the entire country. That, coupled with the fact that it was a port town on the Mississippi River, meant that it had a lot of people moving through it. And because of all that movement, they had a lot of these disease outbreaks. One of those outbreaks is so severe, it leads to Tennessee revoking Memphis's city charter and taking direct control over the city for 13 years, and at time imposing very strict quarantines, not allowing people in or out of the city. And then over here, we have our Centennial Monument. Just like we are the Bicentennial celebration, there was also a Centennial celebration. The columns around the Centennial Monument talk about the different buildings that were at the Centennial Expo. The mid to late 1800s is that era of expos and World's Fairs. So the idea for Tennessee's Centennial celebration was going to be, we're going to do the same thing and build a large expo. This will go on to be the largest expo in the Southeast at that time. They essentially build a tiny city, building buildings for, there was a women's building, a children's building, an African-American building that talked about how those groups have changed over the past 100 years. They had a forestry and geology building that talked about the nature of Tennessee. And then most famously, they had a pyramid for Memphis, Tennessee, and the Parthenon for Nashville, Tennessee. All of those buildings were meant to be temporary, but when Nashvillians went in after the expo was over to tear those buildings down, they couldn't bring themselves to tear down the building that represented Nashville. And so the Parthenon lasted until about the 1910s, at which point it was getting so dilapidated it had to be removed and was replaced in the 1920s. And that's the current concrete building that we have today. Here in 1909, we have statewide prohibition going into effect. This is well before federal prohibition. Jack Daniels, one of the most recognizable alcoholic brands in the world, is still made in a dry county. They've actually passed some local ordinances that allow them to sell commemorative bottles. This breaking the wall in 1916, any guesses why? International news. World War I. If you've ever been to War Memorial Plaza on Capitol Hill, it's right on the other side of the Capitol building. The War Memorial Plaza building and the statue, a large statue inside of it, is the state's World War I memorial. The idea at that time was we were going to make this massive memorial because this is the war to end all wars. Unfortunately, there's a number of other memorials in that plaza now. The most prominent Tennessean and potentially American to come out of the war is Alvin C. York. Alvin C. York grows up in a small town on the Cumberland Plateau called Palmau, Tennessee. He is actually a conscientious objector during the first part of the war and doesn't want to go fight. But he's also a very religious man, so he decides to take a camping trip into the Cumberland Plateau. During that, prays over it, and ultimately decides that he can do more good by going to war than by staying at home. While in France, he leads a group of about a dozen men into capturing 130 Germans and their machine guns and marching them to the front line as prisoners of war. And for his actions on that day, he ends up receiving the Medal of Honor. When he comes home, he is wildly famous. He has ticker tape parades in his name. Hollywood makes a movie about his life. He is hugely famous. In fact, that was only a couple of years of his life. Him being at war was only a couple of years. What's important is what he did once he came back home. He used that fame to build a school for his local community because he only had a third grade education into his 20s. He also built a trade school so that they could learn different jobs. He was a very big advocate of veterans' rights. A lot of veterans after World War I had issues with getting different benefits, especially health benefits, so he really tried to support them in that. And then as we go into the Great Depression and World War II, he was a very big advocate for a lot of the programs during those eras. So he tried to use that fame for as much good as he possibly could. Here in 1918, 1919, moon pies are created. I'm going to preface this by saying I love moon pies. I have nothing against moon pies. But when I think snack cakes, I think
Little Debbie.
Little Debbie. In the 1920s, McKee Foods is created in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And in 1960, they create the Little Debbie brand based off of the granddaughter of the founder of the company. So that little girl is a real little girl. That outfit was her favorite play outfit. She's actually on the board of executives now. For some reason, despite arguably being a much bigger brand, Little Debbie does not appear anywhere on the wall. And I do not know who moon pies paid off, but I think it's a little odd. On top of that, Mallory's from the Chattanooga area, so she hates when I say this, but on top of that, Chattanoogans' diets in the late 1800s, very questionable. They start bottling Coke, eating moon pies, eating Little Debbies, and in a couple decades, they create Crystal's hamburgers. So
There is an
advertisement sign they have at York that is a moon pie, and I think it's a Pepsi. And it says best lunch around. I'm like, a moon pie and a Pepsi. That's a good
in 1920, we have the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. That amendment passes the Tennessee State Legislature by one vote. That one vote is Harry T. Burns. He is the youngest representative at the time, and he had actually been elected to office only a few months prior to this. This era is called the War of the Roses because if you were pro-suffrage, you wore a yellow pin or a yellow rose. If you were anti-suffrage, you wore red pins, red roses, things like that. he actually came from a staunchly anti-suffrage area and was wearing a red pin on the day that he voted yes for the passage of the 19th Amendment. The first time they do the vote and get to him and he says yes, they essentially say, "You're young, you're new, you don't know what you're doing. We're going to vote a second time." Go around, get to him a second time, he votes yes, and all pandemonium breaks loose. The suffragists who were in the balcony above start throwing roses down, everything turns into pandemonium. There's no proof of this, but there is a story that he supposedly snuck out of one of the windows and climbed down a drain pipe in order to get away because he was worried about what was going to happen. But he ultimately felt he had to explain himself, and so the next day he gives a speech on the House floor, and he says that while he was waiting to vote, a page boy brought him a letter, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but the letter essentially said, "You better be a good boy and vote for this." And so he did, and he told them that letter was from my mother, and my mother is my best friend, and she has never led me astray, so I had to vote for it. So more so than to Harry T. Burns passing the 19th Amendment, Harry T. Burns' mother passed the 19th Amendment. I tell people all the time, that is not cheating. It's a constituent talking to the representative. Just a very important constituent. We go into the 20s and the 30s. What's the major thing going on in the United States?
Great Depression.
Depression, exactly. Perfect. So during the Great Depression, Tennessee had 3 major programs going on during it. We have the Civilian Conservation Corps, which puts men in their late teens and early 20s to work so they have money to send back home. We have the Works Projects Administration, which is a very similar program, but they worked with women, older men, different groups other than the CCC. Those 2 organizations did things like replanting billions of trees throughout the nation. They helped with building a lot of the state and national parks throughout the country. They also tried to use this program for as much good, so a lot of them would bring in teachers to make sure that the men were literate and could read and write. They also brought in skilled masons and woodworkers to help teach them a trade. So a lot of those cabins and lodges at parks that they built are very ornately built. The other project that they worked on is the Tennessee Valley Authority. So again, thinking about that map that we looked at earlier, Tennessee has an abundance of rivers, and so it was picked for the TVA to be put in, one to help control floodwaters, but also to bring hydroelectric power to the United States, or to the Southeast. So they would have built a lot of those dams, especially the retaining dams. So every one of those big hydroelectric dams that you think about, there's many, many more retaining dams around helping to keep that water in. This is the state's official World War II memorial. The gold stars on the ground represent the 5,731 Tennesseans who gave their lives during the war. The columns on this side represent the Pacific Theater. The columns on this side represent the European Theater. The 7 benches behind you are the 7 Medal of Honor recipients from Tennessee.
But this is actually a time capsule here, and it's going to be the one that's going to be opened up the most soon. And it's going to be in 2045. So I'm actually really excited to see that. I'm definitely going to be making my way back here to check out what's in that time capsule. But if you turn around, we have a big globe here. That is an 18,000 pound granite globe that represents, and if you notice there are lines on this globe, this is the distance traveled by Tennesseans in this Great War. And a little funny fact about this globe, it is actually made in Germany. So one of the battles of the war is as a German creator. That is kind of funny to me.
Dude, you were on a
Time
roll.
capsule is just a taste of what's to come. We have 99 time capsules in the park.
Wow.
And as Christian mentioned, this one will be open in 2045, 100 years after the end of World War II. Wow.
One of the interesting things that's happened during it here, specifically in Tennessee during World War II, is called the Tennessee Maneuvers. So we've mentioned that limestone, that karst topography throughout the tour. The federal government looked throughout the entire nation and decided that Middle Tennessee best resembled the European theater of anywhere in the nation. So they brought thousands of troops to Middle Tennessee, machinery, and did practicing maneuvers throughout Middle Tennessee before going to Europe.
Oh, yes. And we have this chair here. This is our chair of honor. It's for those who did not return from war. It's kind of for all of the wars along the wall, but it's situated as the Korean War across from the Korean War. So it's for prisoners of war and people who are missing in action. So this is one of the updates that we've had to the park, which is kind of unique because we don't have
As we go into the late 50s and the 60s, the major thing going on in the United States is, civil rights. So we've talked about how Tennessee was at the crossroads of Native American rights, women's rights. It's the exact same for the civil rights movement. We are perfectly situated in the middle of the eastern half of the United States. So we constantly have people going through us. Universities like Fisk University, Vanderbilt University held conferences throughout the civil rights movement. Fisk University actually held trainings throughout that put civil rights activists through simulations of what to expect when they went throughout the Southeast and were confronted with violence so that they could be able to stay nonviolent and pacifist. And what our Civil Rights Memorial represents are the Nashville sit-ins. The Nashville sit-ins are not the first sit-in movement, but it is one of the largest and most successful sit-in movements. Students from Meharry, American Baptist College, Fisk University, and Tennessee State University, TSU, the four historically black colleges and universities here in Nashville, along with their allies, spent months sitting at lunch counter stools throughout Nashville to protest segregation, most famously at Woolworth's, but they did it throughout Crystal's Hamburgers all over the place. After a number of months, Nashville will eventually go on to be the first major city in the Southeast to not only desegregate its lunch counters, but all public spaces. Diane Nash famously confronted the mayor of Nashville on the courthouse steps and asked him if he thought it was fair that they were treated differently, and he said no, and they ultimately changed that law shortly after. The most infamous thing to happen in Tennessee during this time period is the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. at Lorraine Motel. He is in Memphis to help support city sanitation workers who are on strike for better pay and better working conditions. One cool thing that did happen is in 1986, we have Homecoming 86. Y'all said y'all are from Tennessee. Are y'all born in Tennessee?
Mm-hmm.
So you remember Homecoming 86?
I think I've still got like a packet with the blanket over the rocking chair.
Yep,
Yeah.
that was the logo. Homecoming 86 was a statewide celebration that tasked local communities with researching, preserving, and sharing their local history. This was kind of like the pre-gaming for the Bicentennial. Many of the organizations that formed during Homecoming 86 will last through the Bicentennial to help prepare for it. 1992, 1996, Al Gore Jr. is elected vice president. Had he won the 2000 election, he would have been the first president actually born in Tennessee.
And now we've reached 1996. So I'm stealing Jackson's joke, but all history ends. And yay, Bicentennial's open. But we're going to walk this way. We're going to head towards these towers. This is our Carillon bell system. There's 50 towers and it houses 95 bells. Those are to represent the 95 counties in the state. So the smallest one is around 18 pounds and the largest one is 500 pounds. It's technically two different Carillon systems. There's a brass system and an iron system. Unfortunately, right now, neither of the systems are working, so we can't play the bells, but we will go down into what we call our Court of Three Stars, which represents our grand divisions, and there's an acoustic center that we can check out. As y'all walk by here, you might see some names engraved all the way around these benches. Those are different singers, songwriters, composers, musicians from Tennessee or that we want to honor, including Elvis Presley. He is up at the top, and then Dolly Parton is somewhere that direction.
In my personal opinion, Dolly deserves to be at the top. But that's just me.
Yeah, and she shares a bench with someone.
And she
That's
shares
not
a
right.
bench with somebody. That's just not right.
We love her in 97. I don't know what happened.
Not that the king is not the king. He is. Thank you very much.
All right, so there's a metal pin right here. This is the acoustic center of our Carillon. I don't know if you can hear me, but I was echoing just a little bit. Sometimes we have kids groups come and clap and like sing a song. So
It's actually really fun.
yeah, if y'all want to do that, go for it. No pressure. I mean, y'all heard the echo, so.
That
and then
is
here
crazy.
we also have our Capitol View Shed that I think Jackson has and Christian have mentioned.
So that's why this site was built, is to preserve this.
This view. And we'll keep on going. We'll head over to the nature side.
So we are now moving into the nature portion of the park. Our Civilian Conservation Corps memorial is on this side, which is very apt considering they would have spent the vast majority of their time in nature. Behind me, I mentioned it on the other side, but behind me is the Tennessee State Library and Archives. The panels around the building are the different state symbols of Tennessee. It is not all of them, but it's many of them. So this is the nature side. Before you are the Smoky Mountains. We are currently in East Tennessee, and as we move through the park, the berms are going to get lower and lower as though we're going into Middle Tennessee, and then eventually completely flatten out as though we're in West Tennessee. The flora is also going to change, so we have hardwoods that you'd have at higher elevations on this side of the park, and as we go into Middle Tennessee and West Tennessee, we'll talk about those plants as well. These circles on the ground are the majority of our time capsules. There are 95 time capsules, one for every county in Tennessee. A little bit to y'all's left is the Sound Stadium. The Sound Stadium sits roughly in the same location as Sulphurdale Stadium, which is a very prominent stadium in early baseball history. That sulphur part of the stadium name comes from, again, those springs that we had in this area, the sulfur deposits those springs left behind. The most famous thing that I know of that happened at Sulphurdale Stadium is Hank Aaron had his regular season debut at Sulphurdale Stadium when he was a teenager. This is Magnolia Cove. Mallory, you want to talk about Magnolia Cove?
Trying to grab some illustration here. So we call this Magnolia Cove because we noticed that there are a bunch of different types of magnolias in this area, which is great because it represents, this area is kind of still East Tennessee, but more like the Cumberland Plateau, which is where a lot of these magnolias thrive. So we have a big leaf magnolia right here. You can tell it's a big leaf magnolia because it has these little lobes here, and the leaves are massive, which is a great tell. Some of them can be up to 3 feet long. Then we have this other magnolia that looks very similar. This one is called an umbrella magnolia, and it has an attachment that's just straight down, so it's a little bit different than the curve of the big leaf magnolia. This is our umbrella magnolia tree. And you can tell that they're different species because of how they're tolerating the heat that we've had recently. Our big leaf magnolia is not doing so hot right now, unfortunately. It's meant for, you know, a little bit cooler conditions. And then behind you is a cucumber tree magnolia. And Jackson can tell you a little bit about them.
Up there on the hill, you can see the southern magnolia, which is what y'all are going to be probably the most used to seeing when you say magnolia. It's very popular for landscaping, which is why we see it so much, but we think it's really cool to see this contrast of, like, that's what we normally see, and these are the more native kinds. There's about half a dozen different magnolia species native to Tennessee. All right, so we have firmly transitioned into Middle Tennessee. The majority of the trees, or a large portion of the trees in Middle Tennessee, are these cedar trees. I told y'all earlier, Europeans, not always the best at naming things. Cedar trees are juniper trees, but they reminded Europeans of old world cedar trees, and so they gave them that name. The reason that we have these here in the park is to help represent cedar glades. Cedar glades are microenvironments that are only found in Middle Tennessee. All of that limestone that we have, some of that's exposed directly to sunlight, and that sunlight heats it up to a point where it creates a desert-like environment. So you're going to find things like prickly pear cactus, yucca plants, which are these little plants over here, and cedar trees, because cedar trees are very hardy trees that do not need a lot of soil. You're also going to have lots of wildflowers, like a Tennessee coneflower, in those areas. Places like Cedars of Lebanon State Park, Henry Horton State Park, Stones River National Battlefield have those cedar glades. It's a very cool place if you like nature, because you can see the whole environment kind of evolve in front of you, because you start with these big sheets of rock. Over time, because of weathering or the trees and the plants breaking up that rock, it gets smaller and smaller. And then as those plants rot away and leave soil, you'll eventually end up with a deciduous forest. So it's a really cool thing to see. So here to y'all's right are some columns. These are the original columns for the Capitol building. So I know I keep hammering away this local limestone, but these are made with local limestone. So these last until about the 1950s, at which point there is a project to renew the entire Capitol building, the interior and the exterior, and these are removed and replaced with Indiana limestone. They're moved to the state penitentiary and left in a field until eventually a reliquary is made at the Capitol building. Here, MTSU has a reliquary. There are a couple dotted around the Middle Tennessee area. It's very apt that they were moved to the state penitentiary, because that is actually, in a way, where they came from. The reason we have the columns here is to talk about the 3 different groups that built the Capitol building. It's going to be imprisoned individuals, enslaved individuals, and immigrants. Imprisoned individuals, it was a selling point for moving the Capitol here that the state penitentiary was here and there was a quarry nearby, and so those individuals were used as free labor to do a lot of the quarry work for the building itself. Enslaved individuals, it was not uncommon for slave owners during this time to rent out their slaves to make money off of their labor, either to the federal government, state government, or private individuals. Those individuals would have done a lot of the hauling of material, the clearing of trees, things like that. And then lastly, those immigrants, the 2 largest immigrant populations are the Irish, which would have done a lot of the carving and polishing of the stone, and then German immigrants, which is why we have Germantown here at the corner of the park. They would have done a lot of the fresco painting inside the building once it was complete. The other reason that the Capitol ended up here, or one of the other reasons the Capitol ended up here in Nashville, is because the mayor of Nashville at the time offered to give the Capitol Hill to the state for free in order to motivate them to choose this as a site. Prior to this, Murfreesboro had been the capital because it's the geographic center of Tennessee. Knoxville had been the capital because early in Tennessee's history, that was the most populated area. And then also, Kingsport was the capital for one day in order to honor the letter, but not the intent of a treaty with the Cherokee, which was that they gave land to the state, and part of that agreement was that they would move the capital to Kingsport. The capital was moved to Kingsport for one day, and the only piece of legislation passed there was to move the capital out of Kingsport.
Wow.
The two major individuals behind the construction of the building are a man named William Strickland and a man named Samuel Morgan. William Strickland is a prominent architect from the time period. He is very well known for the Greco-Roman Revival style. If you've ever wondered why Capitol buildings, courthouses, town halls look very similar to each other, big blocks with columns, it's because during the early and mid 1800s, that Greco-Roman Revival style was very big in the United States because the idea that we were taking the mantle of democracy from Greece and Rome. One of his other big architectural feats here in Nashville is the Downtown Presbyterian Church. I personally think it's really cool. It is an Egyptian Revival style. So the exterior looks very much like a normal church. You go inside, boom, Pharaoh's Tomb. It's very cool. He's the architect. The other man, Samuel Morgan, is on the Capitol Committee that is overseeing the construction project. Samuel Morgan is also independently wealthy, and the project ends up going over budget and over schedule. And so he actually donates a lot of his own personal wealth to help complete the Capitol building. One of the main reasons it went over schedule and over budget is because there were a number of high-profile fires in other buildings during this time. The original plan was for the building to have a stone exterior and a wooden interior, which is really common for that time period. But because of those fires, the decisions were made to make the entire building stone. Stone costs more, takes longer to get, and so the project ends up going over budget and over schedule. If you are the architect and you're over budget and over schedule, who do you blame? The financier. If you're the financier and you're over budget and over schedule, who do you blame? The architect. So Samuel Morgan and William Strickland did not get along with one another. William Strickland ends up passing away before the project's completed, but he sees it coming, so he asked the state legislature if he could be honored by being buried in the building, and they said yes. So he is buried in the northern exterior wall. Samuel Morgan passes away after the project is completed, but his family approaches the state legislature and say, hey, he donated a lot of his own money to get this building completed. Can he be honored by being buried in the building? They say yes. So he is buried in the southern exterior wall of the Capitol building. So two men who did not get along with each other are buried in our Capitol, but they are as physically far apart from one another as possible. Sarah Polk and James Polk are also in a mausoleum on the Capitol grounds. I told y'all earlier that their house was a couple of blocks away from the Capitol building. They had no children. And because Sarah survived James by so many years, by the time she passed away, there was no clear inheritance, or anybody, a clear person to inherit their property. And so by the time that they finished the legal battle over who would inherit the property, and also just the time that it elapsed that she lived in the house was eventually condemned and torn down. And so at that time, they were exhumed and moved from the house to the Capitol grounds. So we are the only Capitol that has a former president and first lady at it, and hopefully the only Capitol that has 4 bodies. We continue to get flatter and flatter as we go through Middle Tennessee. We'll eventually transition into West Tennessee. Here in West Tennessee, we have river oats, which is this grassy looking thing. We also have swamp oaks. We have cypress trees, plants that you would find in that swampier West Tennessee environment of the Mississippi River. But this is our amphitheater. It's a 2,200 seat amphitheater. It is here for one pragmatic reason, so that we have an event space, but also so that we pull that Greco-Roman style into the park and near the Capitol building. So that is why the amphitheater was chosen. This is the park's 200-foot map of Tennessee. It is the largest map of Tennessee in the world, or so we claim, and no one's corrected us. We're not sure why it would be anywhere else. Shows all of the major riverways, roadways, railways of Tennessee. The little plastic discs are lights that light up at night. They're the 95 county seats, so the city for each county. The little pedestals behind me are smaller maps that talk about the geology of Tennessee, musical heritage, a depiction of one of the first drawn maps of Tennessee, because it is a topographic map of Tennessee.
Oh.
So
That
it
is
really
cool.
helps to illustrate those 3 grand divisions that we have. So from here over, we have East Tennessee. It's also illustrates a very important thing for the people of the Cumberland Mountains, or the Cumberland Plateau. They are not the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. The Tennessee River carves out, and its estuaries carve out a very large valley between the Smokies and the Cumberland Plateau. This is why many people in the Cumberland Plateau will say that they are neither part of East Tennessee or Middle Tennessee, but their own distinct thing. And it's because if you look at a map, they very much are. This right here is the Sequatchie Valley, which is carved out by the Sequatchie River. This portion here is the Middle Tennessee Grand Division, and we have the West Tennessee Grand Division. This is carved out by the Duck River that we talked about earlier. This is the Middle Tennessee Basin, but this is going to be where portions of Nashville and Middle Tennessee are. And then you can also see how the Mississippi River has carved out large sections of this portion of Tennessee. And I will say, one of the interesting things about the map as well is that it does show that although West Tennessee is flat compared to the other divisions, it does have a lot of substance to it. And depending on where you are, you can get very pretty waterfalls and gullies and things like that.
In my personal opinion, this is one of the coolest maps because it kind of depicts how Tennessee in general is very unique. I think I told one of y'all before, we have almost every single kind of ecosystem you can think of. Like temperate rainforests in the Appalachian Mountains. We have temperate desert-like areas in cedars of Lebanon. Plateaus, we have rivers. I think the only thing we don't have is volcanic activity. And even then, we had an earthquake over on the west side of Tennessee, which no, it's not volcanic, but still close enough, so we'll call it that. But sorry, go ahead, Jack.
Oh, you're totally fine. Now I'm just picturing us having a volcano.
And now we're
Yeah, there you go.
Let's not go that far.
But that being said, this is the end of our tour. We appreciate y'all coming out. We will be in the area for a few more minutes in the visitor center and all that stuff. If y'all have any questions, but thank you for visiting us.
That's awesome. Thanks, guys. Thank y'all so much.
Even in the darkest conditions, the magical little mushrooms grow. They are part of the circle of life, reaching places high and low. Just like the mighty little mushrooms, stay flexible and resilient too. Plant one in your pocket and good things will come to you.
Ka-chow. We're going on a tour, even though we've lived here all my life. Here's the question of the day. If you could have a pet dinosaur or a pet dragon, which would you choose and why?
I want a dinosaur because some dinosaurs are nice and they eat plants instead of me.
Well, I already have a pet dinosaur. His name is Pickle. I got him from Target.
I'd go with the dragon because you know it's going to be able to fly.
But then it could eat you.
The dinosaur could eat you.
But there's some dinosaurs that don't eat you.
There are some dragons that don't eat you.
Which ones?
Smoke,
And-
Wings, and Fire from Sophia the First.
Yeah, also, I wouldn't have to worry about ever making a fire.
Sure.
And you would have, well, depending on the dragon that you picked, you would have a 3-part harmony. You could join it, be a quartet. Just finished the tour. What do you think?
Informational.
Definitely long walk. It was interesting.
How would you rate the tour?
7.5.
I think it's a 9.5. The actual history part was cool. There's a train going by right now.
I mean, it was a little bit.
Our parents are yapping with the park rangers.
I think I just took like 17 million thousand steps.
I have tiny feet, so I took 4,000 steps.
And I mean,
Okay, good night.
Bye.